August 1942, jungle of Guadalcanal. The rain had already fallen for days. The vegetation dripped silent. On the ground, mud, leaves, and bodies scattered among the trees. Ahead, Japanese scouts crawled in formation, confident that the engagement, as they had learned from the imperial manuals, would be decided by bayonet. They had trained for it. Against the British, against the Chinese. The formula worked. And that night, it would work again. It didn't work. What the Japanese generals called spiritual superiority in hand-to-hand combat found for the first time a sound that was not in their doctrines: the bursting and violent firing of an American 12-gauge shotgun with a bomb action loaded with buckshot, a weapon that they had not even classified as a threat, a weapon that, for them, still belonged to the world of swamp hunting. This is the story of an ignored gun, not because she was weak, but because she was improbable. The shotgun did not win battles. It did not turn the tide of war, but it exposed something much bigger: the collapse of a doctrine that refused to see the reality of modern warfare. What Japan did not expect was not American power. It was American practicality. And this mistake didn't make noise. It did damage. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story, and it's not where it should be. The United States produced more than 100,000 military rifles during World War II. Of these, tens of thousands were destined for the Pacific Theater, and yet, they have all but disappeared from combat records. No specific mention in the action reports, no entry into post-war Japanese interrogations, no written doctrine, no formal complaint, no diplomatic protest, and yet, they appear in the photos, in the patrols, in the training manuals, in the hands of lone sentinels on forgotten islands, like an armed shadow that cuts through the jungle, present but ignored. If you value historical accuracy, forgotten details, and the actual reconstruction of conflicts, consider liking and subscribing. This gesture helps the channel to continue digging up stories that, for convenience or silence, the official memory preferred to leave behind. On Guadalcanal, the enemy was the forest. The vegetation not only hid men, but also sound. The fighting took place in natural corridors only 5 or 6 meters wide, among palm trees, twisted branches, and forests that muffled even the screams. Visibility rarely exceeded 30 yards. In certain areas, 5 steps forward, and the soldier was already disappearing from the eyes of the squad itself. The humidity reached 100%. Everything swelled, rotted, moldy. Uniforms, shoes, weapons. The jungle did not respect doctrines, and in this, Japanese doctrine began to crumble. Trained for night infiltrations, bayonet attacks, and spiritualized close-quarters combat, the imperial soldiers believed that the forest would level the playing field, that courage would overcome steel, that fanaticism would conquer fire. But the forest did not level. It hid, confused and disoriented, and hidden in it was a weapon that the Japanese had not seen in manuals: the American bomb-action shotgun. American doctrine, although initially unprepared for this type of war, showed something that Japan could never simulate: the ability to adapt on an industrial scale. The U.S. logistics system was able to study, prototype, test, and distribute combat doctrines based on the real environment, and to do so in a matter of months. The units that landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 had already received specific instructions for combat in dense forest. It wasn't just the shotgun. It was the wrist compass, the aluminum canteen, the individual mosquito net, the light uniform, night shooting practice, the deck of operational doctrines sent inside the backpack. It was industry shaping the doctrine. Meanwhile, on the other side of the jungle, the Imperial Army relied on the idea that the spirit was a sharper weapon than any projectile. This ancient, almost religious belief manifested itself in the way his men marched in silence for miles, carrying Arisaka rifles as extensions of his soul. But neither faith nor the blade was effective against something that could fire 9 buckshot projectiles at once with a simple repetition of movement. The Winchester Model 1897, in the hand of a sentry positioned behind a log, gave no warning. It did not require aim. It was enough to hear a crack in the foliage and pull the bomb. During the first half of 1942, the United States produced more steel than all of Japan during the year. And this is where the surprise takes shape. While Japan calculated war based on courage and austerity, the Americans responded with tonnage. In less than a year, The Marines had been trained, equipped, and sent to the other side of the planet with an inventory that included not only standard rifles but also specialized combat rifles, tools designed for just such combat. And even without being part of the central doctrine, these weapons fulfilled a critical function: to close the blind spaces, to master the unexpected, to turn the first line of contact into a shrapnel hell. At this point, it's worth a break. By 1943, American production of military rifles exceeded Japan's total capacity to produce any type of handgun tenfold. The Springfield Arsenal, Winchester, Remington, and other plants were churning out thousands of units a month, some of them destined exclusively for jungle patrols. If this scale surprises you, write in the comments, "absolute power," because that's exactly what it represented. Not only volume, but the ability to adapt production to the tactical environment, something that Japan, stuck in its doctrinal culture, could not keep up with. But the forest did not forgive mistakes. Neither on the Japanese side nor on the American side. The same environment that favored quick and devastating ambushes also exacted a high price from those who dared to improvise. Humidity corroded the mechanisms. The rain erased traces and left useless ammunition. The jungle became a neutral but active enemy. And it is at this point that the shotgun is inserted as a contradictory piece. Thought of as a weapon of rapid response, its performance depended on an ammunition that it swelled with the weather. Still, its mere sound was enough to redefine the morale of a patrol. A scout armed with a pump-action shotgun gave the impression that the unexpected was covered. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued to infiltrate at night, armed with bayonets and bolt-action rifles. They advanced with discipline, but what they expected was silence, or perhaps an isolated shot from M1. What they received was a burst of buckshot, fired in less than 2 seconds. What was supposed to be a moral victory, the assault at close range where the spirit would beat the machine, turned into noise, fire, and immediate death. The tactical field was changing, and the jungle, far from equalizing forces, only exposed the failures of those who refused to adapt. But if the jungle was the field, and the rifle the tactical instrument, there was still a third factor, invisible, but decisive: doctrine. In the next chapter, we will look at how Japan prepared its soldiers for a type of warfare that no longer existed. A war taught by generals who never faced an enemy with factories. A war in which courage was enough. And so, upon hearing the sound of the shotgun, many did not even understand what hit them. By the 1930s, Japan believed it had understood the essence of modern warfare. But their understanding was shaped by a romantic vision and deeply rooted in feudal values, where victory was attributed less to the machine and more to the spirit. The official doctrine of the Imperial Army reinforced this pillar. Combat should be won with absolute discipline, personal sacrifice, and the silent courage of the blade. Bayonets were proudly polished. The manuals were filled with instructions on night infiltration, close combat, and surprise melee weapon attacks. The notion of glory was still linked to physical contact with the enemy. The bullet was not noble, the explosion impersonal. The true warrior won by looking into the eyes of those who fell, and it was with this mental model that Japan prepared to face the 20th century, a century that had mercilessly chosen industry as its battlefield. Japanese doctrine, despite its symbolism and tradition, had been born old, and no one, within the military leadership, seemed willing to update it. In the early years of the war, this strategy seemed to work. In 1937, against the ill-equipped Chinese, the nighttime infiltration attacks were devastating. In 1941, during the invasion of British Malaya, the Japanese advanced on bicycles, using the jungle as cover, attacking with speed and surprise, while the British waited on the main roads. But these victories were not products of doctrine. They were the fruit of unprepared opponents. There was no logistical confrontation, no air resistance, and no mechanized coordination of forces. Japan confused fragility with inferiority and underestimated the difference between defeating a colony and facing an industrial power. When the U.S. Marines landed in the Pacific Islands, they did not carry honor in their backpacks. Steel, repetition, and concentrated fire were brought. Japan was about to discover that bayonets do not pierce lead walls. The samurai doctrine, when transported to the modern battlefield, began to produce structural flaws. The first mistake was tactical. Close combat required Japanese soldiers to expose themselves to reach the optimal short distance. But this approach, in environments covered by artillery, machine guns, and rapid-action rifles, became a sentence. The second mistake was strategic. The doctrine did not provide for unconventional weapons, flamethrowers, demolition charges, mines, shipborne aviation. None of these threats were listed as a priority in the training manuals, which created fatal gaps in field adaptation. The third mistake was cultural. The disregard for certain weapons, such as the shotgun, caused officers to ignore their psychological and functional impact. For imperial strategists, a short dispersal weapon was not honorable enough to enter into debate. The doctrinal silence regarding the shotgun said more about the commando mentality than about the gun itself. But the deeper error was a moral one. By maintaining a doctrine founded on the mythology of individual sacrifice, Japan ignored the reality of a war where time, supply, and the chain of production determined the winner. American industry didn't just produce weapons, it produced adaptable doctrine. The U.S. Army field-tested, observed failures, and adjusted instructions based on statistics. With each island conquered, a new manual emerged. By February 1942, after the first engagements on Guadalcanal, the schools at Camp Pendleton were already updating their jungle combat instruction. This cycle of observation, correction, and redistribution was unthinkable in the top-down structure of the Japanese army, where the officer's word was dogma and tradition was more valuable than efficiency. Japan was struggling with the past. America responded with the future. This difference was not visible in the first shot, but it became evident in the 10th. When the Japanese attacked with frontal assaults, they encountered lead walls fired from fortified positions. When they attempted night infiltrations, their silhouettes were torn by bursts of shotguns in slam-fire mode, firing 6 buckshot projectiles in 2 seconds. When Japanese positions were detected, they were visited by flamethrowers and naval artillery, weapons absent from the Japanese repertoire. Japanese doctrine expected the duel between 2 men with rifles. What he found was coordination between planes, radios, tanks, and infantry, a war machine, not an individual adversary. And this machine learned. Japan, out of pride, did not learn. The clearest example of this rigidity was in his own contempt for the rifle. To imperial strategists, it was a hunting weapon. It did not deserve analysis. It did not deserve countermeasures. But on the battlefield it appeared in the most critical places, in the hands of scouts on the flanks of patrols, in night defenses. Even though it was a fraction of the American arsenal, its impact was symbolic, a weapon without glory, but with function, a crude tool, made for jungle, rain, and ambush. Japanese doctrine, by ignoring it, revealed its deepest fragility. It was not only conservative, she was blind. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officials admitted surprise at the type of weaponry used by the Americans. They expected traditional resistance. They were given concentrated industrial power. A Japanese lieutenant, interrogated after the Battle of Peleliu, described the war with a phrase that summed it all up. "We brought courage. They brought everything." This observation was not just rhetorical, it was statistics. By 1943, the United States was already delivering more than 40,000 military shotguns to Marines, as well as 6,000 flamethrowers and hundreds of thousands of tons of adapted ammunition. Japan, that same year, was unable to replace its own lost rifles on Guadalcanal. The Japanese doctrine had overcome the past, but the war was in the present, and in the present, it was being crushed. But this doctrinal clash was still just the beginning, because while the shotgun stunned Japan in the field, something even more telling was happening in the shadows of the military bureaucracy. It wasn't being registered, no formal protest, no mention in the reports of the Japanese high command, no tactical response. The weapon was in use, it was killing, but she was invisible to anyone who refused to see her. In the next chapter, we will get into practice. We'll see the Winchester Model 1897 in action, its close-range lethality, and the kind of terror it caused when fired in the dark, because the jungle was a blind field, and in the dark, the sound of the bomb sounded like a sentence. The jungle of the Pacific offered no warnings. The enemy appeared a few meters away, often invisible until the last moment. And in this theater, the Japanese doctrine bet all its chips on courage, the blade, and the night surprise. But what she found was a sound that was not in war manuals. The dry rumble of a Winchester Model 1897 in slam-fire mode, a type of continuous firing, in which the trigger is held down, while the bomb action automatically reloads and fires the next charge. 6 12-gauge buckshot projectiles fired in about 2 seconds. Each cartridge contained 9 8.38mm bullets, with enough energy to pass through flesh, bone, tree trunk, or any organic resistance within a radius of 30 meters. It was a concentrated explosion of destruction, designed to end fighting before it began. The Model 1897, created by John Browning, had a 20-inch barrel, perforated heat shield, and bayonet coupling. But its true differentiator was invisible. There was no trigger disconnector, allowing for pure slamfire, a technical detail that made it devastating in trained hands. The enemy could move silently for hours, crawling in the wet brush. But all it took was a branch to break, and hell was unleashed in response. The impact of this weapon in close combat was not only physical, it was psychological. The Japanese doctrine, centered on infiltration and lightning bayonet attack, presupposed a slow, confused, fragmented American response. But when the first Japanese scout appeared among the trees, he didn't get shot. He received 9, then 9 more, then 9 more. In 2 seconds, the vegetation was swept away. And when the attack was at night, the sound of the shotgun's bomb action cut through the silence with an unmistakable mechanical timbre, a warning that the flank was protected. The Model 12, which partially replaced the 1897 from 1943, retained lethal power, but with technical improvements to the internal mechanism. It featured a built-in hammer system, making firing smoother and reducing lockup accidents. Both weapons used the same type of ammunition, 0.0 buck cartridges with high dispersion and high impact density. At 10 yards, the dispersion was 10 inches. At 20 yards, 20 inches, and so on. In the jungle, where distances rarely exceeded 30 yards, aiming was secondary. What mattered was aiming, shooting, and saturating the space. It was a weapon made to hit without seeing, and that changed everything. The presence of the shotgun in American patrols was not widespread, but it was decisive where it appeared. The Marine with the shotgun walked in front. He was the first to see, the first to shoot. Their role was to clear the way, or close hell on anyone who tried to ambush the patrol. The sound of the gun, added to the roar of the shot, created a sound effect that spread through the jungle like lead thunder. It was more than a shot. It was a warning. Don't move forward. You've been seen. But for Japan, such a weapon did not exist. It was not studied. It was not commented on. It was not expected. It was a civilian weapon, brought from American hunting culture, adapted with military parts, but with no place in samurai logic. And this contempt was not just ignorance, it was a tactical error of judgment. Because on the modern battlefield, where combat lasts seconds and visibility is almost nil, the weapon that responds first is the one that survives. And the shotgun was made for that. During the first few months of the Guadalcanal campaign, Marine units had already reported effective use of the shotgun in patrols, ambushes, and night perimeter defense. Although official reports downplayed their role, focusing instead on machine guns, grenades, and artillery fire, the images spoke for themselves. Men with shotguns positioned in front of the patrols, night sentries wielding the Model 97, scouts advancing with their finger on the trigger and the stock already on their shoulder. It was a weapon for moments when war ceased to be a strategy and returned to pure instinct. For Japan, this type of confrontation should favor its soldiers, trained in hand-to-hand training. But the rifle denied that. It turned first contact into execution, and the melee stopped happening. On Iwo Jima, the weapon has reappeared. Although fewer in number, photographic records show their use in specific situations. Trenches, caves, dead ends, paper ammunition, still vulnerable to moisture, limited use. But where it was possible to shoot, the effect was immediate. However, in all Japanese interrogations conducted after the war, the word shotgun does not appear. There are no direct mentions of the weapon, no countermeasure doctrine, no recognition manual, nothing. For the Japanese command, it simply did not exist as a factor, and perhaps this was his greatest power, that of operating on the margins of the enemy's perception, acting without generating reaction. She was tactical and invisible at the same time. In the United States, shotgun training was formalized in September 1942 with the publication of the TM-9-285 manual. There, the use of the shotgun was treated with technical seriousness. Patrols, ambushes, surveillance, bunker clearing, and perimeter defense. It was a specialized weapon used by men with different training. The instructors warned about ammunition consumption and overheating, but they recognized No other weapon offered the same lethality in such a short space and time. American doctrine, even without placing it at the center of the squadron, recognized its tactical value. Japan, on the other hand, by completely ignoring it, demonstrated the gap between its romantic vision of war and the industrial reality in which it fought. In ballistic tests carried out during and after the conflict, the results confirmed the devastating efficiency of the shotgun at distances of up to 30 meters. The accumulated energy of the 9 bullets per cartridge made each shot equivalent to a small killing field. And unlike a rifle, which requires precision, the shotgun requires only presence and reflexes. In the narrow corridors of the forests, at the cave entrances, in the urban alleys of Manila, this type of weapon made the difference between control and chaos. But its impact has never been recorded in numbers. There are no charts. There are no counts. There is only the sound, dry, repeated, mechanical, the sound that Japan did not expect. But if the sound of the shotgun was heard, its presence was drowned out by something even more disastrous, the failure of the ammunition. In the next chapter, the perfect weapon for the jungle will find itself facing its greatest enemy, humidity, and with that, what seemed to be the unexpected trump card of the American arsenal will become, temporarily, a weapon without function. The rain had ceased for a few hours. Silence gradually returned to the banks of the Tenarú River, on Guadalcanal. The darkness was dense, and on the other side of the line of palm trees the Japanese approached in formation, confident that the night and the element of surprise would do what they had done against the British and Chinese, collapse defenses with a sudden charge of bayonets. The Doctrine had been designed exactly for that scenario: night attack, infiltration, bladed weapon. But what awaited the Imperial soldiers on that August night in 1942 was not a line of nervous rifles. It was a surveillance system interspersed with sentries armed with Winchester Model 1897 shotguns. Positioned in camouflaged holes, silent, and guided by intelligence reports that already predicted the Japanese tactic, these soldiers did not react with hesitation. They reacted with slam fire. The first to advance were literally dismantled by a sequence of .00 buck cartridges. Each shot spread 9 projectiles. In 2 seconds, a single shotgun could set 50 to 60 metal spheres in motion. The attackers did not retreat. They were erased. The next waves, disoriented, continued to advance, and found more of the same. Shotguns were not in all the posts. They were not standard weapons, but they were in the right places, and there its effect was not measured in documented casualties, but in enemy behavior. The Japanese team lost pace. The night onslaught turned into confusion. The dispersal fire, followed by bursts of bars and hand-dropped grenades, created a vortex of panic. The doctrine based on bayonet and close contact collapsed in the face of a weapon that did not require aim, only reflexes. The Japanese officers, realizing that their units were being destroyed before they came within 20 meters of the enemy, had no way to react. There was no equivalence tool in the Japanese arsenal, and more serious, there was no instruction for this type of confrontation, no flank doctrine, no grenade disruption tactics. What existed was insistence. What was seen was disintegration. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The first reports from American soldiers about the power of the shotgun in close combat came less than 2 months after the initial landing. And yet, the Japanese command never adapted its tactics to this type of threat. While the Americans adapted their doctrine based on direct experience, inserting shotguns into critical tactical positions, Japan doubled down on spiritual discipline and tactical faith. It was an ideological choice, not an operational one, and the result was a mistake that would be repeated on each island. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the invisible gears of the wars that defined the 20th century. In the technical field, the shotgun faced real limitations. Paper ammunition deteriorated rapidly under the humid climate. Often cartridges failed, rotted, became unusable. But even with this obstacle, the gun continued to be used because it was useful. One Marine, when interviewed decades later, explained, "You could rely on the rifle for distance. But when the noise came from 3 meters behind the foliage, I wanted the 97. It was a practical choice, not a doctrinal one. And this difference between doctrine and practice was beginning to reveal the gulf between the two armies. The war that Japan planned no longer existed. The one the Americans were facing was being shaped in real time. Guadalcanal was the first test. And Japan lost more than men that night at the Tanaru. He lost the certainty that his doctrine was unbeatable. The collapse was not immediate, but it started there, in surprise, in disorientation, in the sound of a gun that shouldn't be there, and especially in the absence of an answer. American reports continued to record advances, captures, fierce resistance, but no Japanese corrective action was observed regarding the shotgun. The gun operated off the enemy's radar, invisible in the manuals, unrecognizable in the reports, and yet present, lethal, technique. But this lethality, as we will see below, had a fatal weakness: the ammunition itself. Produced on the basis of pressed cardboard and components vulnerable to the tropical climate, 12-gauge cartridges would become, at first, a logistical risk. And as much as the weapon was ideal, it could not fire if its soul, the cartridge, was compromised. In the next chapter, we will see how the biggest obstacle to the American shotgun was not the Japanese enemy, but the humidity of the jungle, a weakness that almost sealed the early end of the war's most underrated weapon. The forest did not forgive failures. Humidity wasn't a nuisance, it was a sentence. Every cartridge loaded in the jungle was a bet against the weather. And in the case of the Winchester Model 1897 and Model 12 shotguns, that bet was too risky. The standard ammunition used by the U.S. Marines in the early years of the war was made up of pressed paper cases, sealed by wax. In dry conditions they worked perfectly, but on Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Peleliu, and other islands, the air humidity reached 100%. The mud invaded backpacks. Rainwater accumulated inside the shelters, and the cartridges, absorbing this moisture slowly, swelled. The paper case, previously smooth, swelled irregularly, locking inside the gun's chamber. A Marine, when trying to shoot, encountered resistance when it was time to pull the bomb. The cartridge would not come out. The gun jammed. The time it took to force the cartridge out with bayonet or hammer was deadly. The weapon that was supposed to guarantee the first shot became in practice a dead weight. Many abandoned it mid-combat, preferring the M1 Garand, less devastating up close, but reliable in firing. It was the kind of irony that no American factory had predicted. The right gun, with the wrong ammunition. The reports are clear. In reconnaissance units, where the shotgun was critical for flanking actions and immediate defense, soldiers reported the need to check each cartridge daily, cleaning, drying, insulating with waterproof paper, or improvised wrapping. Others used gun grease to try to seal the edges of the cartridge and slow down moisture absorption. Nothing worked consistently. On a patrol in light rain, an entire box of ammunition could become useless in less than 24 hours. The shots, when they occurred, had reduced power or failed completely. On some occasions, cartridges would burst incompletely, leaving fragments of paper in the chamber and requiring total disassembly. One Marine wrote in a letter, "I would rather face Japan with a knife than with these soggy paper cartridges." The problem was not the shotgun. It was the weak link between the industry and the real environment, a logistical translation failure between what was produced in factories and what was faced in the forests of the Pacific. The Army and Marines knew about the problem from the first few months, but the transition to brass cartridges was not straightforward. Brass was a strategic resource, disputed between the production of rifle ammunition, artillery, and electrical components. Prioritizing shotgun shells was seen as secondary, especially in the face of the lower volume of use. In addition, there was a silent bureaucracy. Because the shotgun was not a standard weapon, it was not given priority in logistical debates. Although its tactical impact was recognized in the front units, the Materiel Command in Washington preferred to maintain the use of paper, citing cost, availability, and acceptable efficiency. It was a technocratic and disastrous decision, because in the field where every second decided the life of a patrol, there was no room for acceptable efficiency. The perfect weapon, designed to close off forest corridors with brute force, was now being ignored for the sake of pennies. It was not until 1945, with the publication of the M19 ammunition, that brass cartridges began to be distributed in greater volume to the Pacific. The new ammunition solved the moisture problem, offering reliability even in extreme conditions. But it was too late. The wildest campaigns were already over. The forest had already taken its toll. The shotgun, a brutal promise of close-quarters dominance, had no chance to show its true potential. It was defeated not by the enemy, but by the weather. Not because of the lack of technique, but because of the lack of logistical vision. And here, once again, comes the American irony. The country with the largest industrial capacity in the world, capable of building an aircraft carrier per month, failed to deliver a box of sealed cartridges on time. It was the kind of fault that doesn't go into monuments, but weighs down graves. Still, the lessons remained. The Department of Defense recorded the episode as an example of a failure to integrate logistics and the combat environment. New ammunition testing protocols have been instituted. The concept of operational climate began to be adopted in the early stages of weapons development. Modern war, until then seen as a confrontation of forces, began to be understood as a clash of contexts. What works in Nevada may fail in Guadalcanal, and for those who die in the forest, this difference is everything. In the end, the shotgun survived. It remains in use to this day in various armed forces around the world. But in World War II in the Pacific, it was silenced by something more banal than gunpowder, wet paper. But if the jungle tried to silence the rifle, the reality of urban combat was about to resurrect it. In the next chapter, the scenario changes. No more forests but ruins, tunnels, and rubble. It's the Philippines' turn. And there, between concrete and alleys of fire, the rifle would speak again. This time, with brass. And with revenge. Military history is not only made up of what happened, but of what was remembered. And in this aspect, few weapons were as active in the field and as absent in the records as the 12-gauge shotgun. During World War II, especially in the Pacific, she was photographed, carried, used in ambushes in trenches in alleys of Manila. And yet, in the memories that shape the public perception of the war, it barely exists. The phenomenon is visible in the foundational works of combat historiography. Eugene Sledge, in his visceral account, With the Old Breed, mentions rifles, grenades, bars, even flamethrowers, but not a word about shotguns. Robert Leckie, in Helmet for My Pillow, offers the same silence. There is no indignation, there is no contempt, there is absence. And this absence is not due to the irrelevance of the weapon, but to the way memory filters what it considers epic, symbolic, or representative. The M1 Garand rifle became the icon of the American infantry. The flamethrower has become the symbol of tactical terror. The shotgun, in turn, continued where it has always been, behind the scenes. The explanation lies both in the operational culture of the time and in the later construction of the myth of war. In the American squad structure, the rifle did not occupy a central position. It was a specialty weapon. Given to sentries, his presence was tactical, localized, almost always silent. In a successful ambush, she fired first, and the rest of the squad completed the job. In night combats, it served as a lead alarm. On incursions inside bunkers, he opened the way with a saturation shot. But these actions rarely earned mentions in after-action reports. The credit almost always went to the covering machine gun, to the platoon officer, or to the joint effect. The shotgun was part of the noise, not the speech. And when the speech became a book, a film, and a document, she remained where she began, off the page. Silence is also logistical. The production of rifles during the war was significant. About 100,000 units adapted for military use, but compared to the more than 5 million M1 rifles produced, these weapons were statistically marginal. Its use, distributed among armies, marines, and security forces, was not enough to build a symbol. Post-war American culture also sought clarity, structure, heroic storytelling, and the shotgun, a hunting weapon turned jungle tool, did not fit into this logic. She did not represent bravery. It did not illustrate strategy. It was practical, and therefore forgotten. Hollywood played its part. In the 50s and 60s, the image of the American soldier was fixed. M1 helmet, Garand rifle, cigarette in the corner of his mouth, advance in the open field. Films such as The Longest Day and Sands of Iwo Jima reinforced this iconography. The shotgun, when it appeared, was used by extras, military police, or in fast-paced action scenes, never as a main weapon. In the video games of the following decades, the process was reversed. The rifle was elevated to a symbol of raw power, especially in close combat. Games like Medal of Honor or Call of Duty have turned the weapon into the protagonist with exaggerated sounds, magnified visual effects, and unrealistic destructive power. This distortion created a paradox. Historically, the weapon was underestimated. Culturally, she was overrated. This cycle of absence and exaggeration distorts the public's understanding of their real role. The rifle did not win battles. It did not knock down bunkers alone, but it saved patrols. He protected sentinels. And in many moments, he prevented the enemy advance in forests where the combat was decided in 2 seconds. Military history, by focusing only on high-profile weapons or large-scale strategies, misses the chance to reveal what really makes war work: tactical decisions, logistical improvisations, and tools that, even if simple, change the enemy's behavior. That was what the shotgun was. Not a symbol, but a tool. And like any well-used tool, its success lies in the fact that no one notices it, only the result. Official reports rarely mentioned its use. When they did, it was in vague contexts, such as close-range shooting with a light weapon. The U.S. War Department itself, in reviewing the weapons used in operations in the Pacific, devoted pages to grenades, mortars, and rifles, but offered only footnotes to shotguns. The commanders knew of its usefulness, but at the level of doctrine, it remained invisible. Even technical manuals such as the TM-9285 treated the weapon briefly. Instructions on cleaning, loading, use on patrols, and that's it. No advanced tactics, no doctrinal appreciation. It was as if the Army said, "It works, but let's not talk too much about it." And this reveals something bigger. The way war is recorded depends less on what is effective and more on what is visible. Flashy weapons, grandiose tactics, and coordinated actions generate memory. Tactical tools, no matter how lethal they are, get lost in the routine of war. And when the war ends, what remains are the speeches, not the forgotten shots in the bush. The story of the 12-gauge rifle in World War II is therefore more than a technical episode. It's a reminder that real warfare is made for details, and that these details, when ignored, distort our understanding of the past. But if the reports have remained silent, there is one place where the shotgun has left its signature: on the bodies found after ambushes, in the blood trails in tunnels and trenches, and further on, in the destroyed streets of Manila. Because in urban combat, where every wall can hide a sniper, the shotgun didn't need reconnaissance. It just needed ammunition. In the next chapter, the scenario changes again. From the forest fields to the concrete corridors, the shotgun returns. And this time, she will have her moment of revenge documented. Modern combat is not always defined by the number of casualties, but by the space a weapon occupies in the enemy's mind. And in this respect, the 12-gauge shotgun found its role not so much as an instrument of mass death, but as an intimidating presence. In the practical field, their use was limited: jungle patrols, night watchmen, prisoner containment, and indoor cleaning. It was a niche weapon, but in the moments when it came into action, its impact went beyond the physical. The characteristic sound of bomb action, the metallic pump action, was enough to freeze advances, intimidate ambushes, and make the enemy hesitate. It was, in many cases, more effective as a warning than as an attack. The Japanese, accustomed to hearing rifle shots or grenade explosions, associated the noise of the shotgun with something different. The sound wasn't just distinctive, it was weird. And what is strange? Scares. Fear operates most effectively when the threat is not understood. Veterans have reported this effect. On night patrols, the mere sound of the rifle loading was enough to deter approaches. An American sentry, upon hearing noise in the bush, often chose to fire the pump of the shotgun instead of shooting. Not out of leniency, but out of efficiency. If there was anyone there, they now knew they wouldn't have time to get close. Many combats, according to reports, were avoided by this psychological mechanism. It was a weapon that dominated the sound of the environment. And in war, sound is control. But this control did not come without cost. The shotgun, especially with paper ammunition, was unstable. On humid days, it could fail. In prolonged engagements, his cadence was limited by manual cooldown, and its useful range did not exceed 30 meters. In the open field, it was useless. In the wrong hands, it became a burden. Therefore, it was not widely adopted. It was a weapon for specialists, not for platoons. Still, its moral effect was real. In capture operations, the Americans often used the shotgun as a tool of dominance. A prisoner surrendered by someone with a shotgun had less chance of attempting to escape. The visible firepower, the wide barrel, the presence of cartridge belts, created a sense of helplessness. Soldiers knew that gun, if fired at close range, did not miss. A single shot meant the end, and that was enough to maintain control. In escort operations, especially in the rear, the shotgun was used by military police units and perimeter security. It was symbolic, imposing. It didn't have to be fired to be effective, but this symbolic effectiveness, however impressive, did not translate into broad tactical dominance. The shotgun was effective in the instant, at the moment when the enemy was seen. Outside of that, it could not compete with semi-automatic rifles, light machine guns, or even automatic pistols. It was a weapon of circumstance, and his greatest power lay exactly in this limitation. Over the course of the war, more than 1 million M1 Garand rifles were shipped to the Pacific alone. In contrast, fewer than 80,000 rifles were officially assigned to combat. Total production of military rifles was around 100,000 units, significantly less than the 2 million Garands manufactured until 1945. The proportion was clear. The American bet was on standardization, reliability, and rate of fire. The shotgun, with its brutal short-range power, found no doctrinal room for expansion. It was useful, but isolated. Present, but ignored. This discrepancy between psychological power and tactical importance reveals one of the fundamental ironies of war. The most feared weapon is not always the most effective, and what works in combat does not always find space in institutional memory. American production was so vast that even with restricted use, the country could afford to employ shotguns as auxiliary weapons. The Germans, for example, did not even consider the use of this type of weapon in their frontline troops. Here is a fact that is rarely mentioned. While the United States produced 100,000 military rifles, Germany did not exceed a few hundred similar weapons, many of them confiscated or adapted. The Wehrmacht's focus was on sniper rifles and short-range submachine guns. The idea of a weapon with non-selective dispersion for use in closed environments was simply not considered. German doctrine prioritized control, ammunition economy, and technical training, all of which the shotgun ignored. If this contrast surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that was the real difference, not one of doctrine, but of volume and flexibility. Still, the image of the shotgun survives, not for the books, but for the cinema and the sound. Its lead boom and metallic charging are remembered even when its deeds go uncounted. It is the auditory memory of a weapon that never wanted glory, but fulfilled its role. In Manila, this memory was consolidated. Urban combat brought back the shotgun to the center of the action. There, she ceased to be a shadow in the jungle and became a front line among ruins. The setting, unlike the forest, allowed its lethality to express itself freely. Door to door, room to room, the American shotgun finally found a field where it didn't need to hide. In the next chapter, we go to the Philippines to understand how the shotgun, a weapon ignored in the manuals, became an instrument of survival in the ruins of a city. And what the reports didn't say? The death tolls and combat photos failed to hide. Because there, the short barrel spoke again, loud, dry, and definitive. The history of the 12-gauge shotgun in World War II has always been told with a tone of underestimation, both by the enemy and by the Allies themselves. But now, at the end of the first half of this analysis, an inevitable question emerges. What if the Japanese were right? Not by strategic vision, but by involuntary calculation. And if the reason why Japan has not developed specific doctrines against the rifle, nor included this threat in its war manuals, is not just doctrinal ignorance, but a crude perception that the weapon, however brutal, would never be decisive. The contempt for rifles did not stop Japan from reacting to other threats. When flamethrowers began to be used systematically, especially on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese quickly created fortified positions with lateral dispersion and vents. When the Sherman tanks reached the Pacific, anti-tank tactics were revised with booby traps, mines, and suicide teams. When American naval artillery demonstrated its demolishing power at Tarawa, the bunkers had multiple layers of concrete and independent exits. In other words, when the impact was perceived as existential, there was a response. And with the shotgun, there was nothing. No tactical change, no reorganization, no sign that Japanese commanders even considered it a distinct threat. Not because they were incompetent, but because perhaps they knew what really mattered in the mathematics of modern warfare. The impact of the shotgun, as we have seen, was brutal, localized, and often decisive in small actions, but it wasn't scalable. It was not integrable into far-reaching strategies, and his presence, although morally significant, did not alter the axis of an offensive. There was, for example, not a single Japanese intelligence report identifying the shotgun as a critical factor in the defeats of Guadalcanal, Peleliu, or Manila, nor do post-war interrogations record this weapon as a formal concern. When asked about the most feared weapons, Japanese prisoners listed flamethrowers, phosphorus grenades, and airstrikes. The shotgun was not even mentioned. This leads us to an uncomfortable historical irony. Japan, which structured its doctrine on outdated concepts such as honor in hand-to-hand combat and moral superiority over the enemy, may have ignored the rifle not out of blindness, but out of pragmatism. He may have instinctively realized that that weapon, however frightening, would not change the course of the war, and at this point contempt turns into success. Not a technical hit, but a harmless mistake. Underestimated, and they survived it. This paradox is even more acute when we look at the American side. The United States, with all its industrial machinery, logistics, and capacity for adaptation, bet big on the shotgun at certain times. They manufactured military versions, adapted bayonets, created specific holsters, and designated field functions for their use. But in the end, that energy resulted in limited impact. There were no rifle battalions. There were no campaigns won by them. And there are no monuments dedicated to its use. The gun acted as a footnote, effective when present, forgotten when absent. This is not a criticism of the shotgun. On the contrary, she accomplished exactly what was expected of her: quick response, concentrated firepower, psychological mastery in short spaces. But the war that was being fought in the Pacific was not made up of short and isolated fights. It was a war of supplies, aviation, artillery, and engineering. A war where whoever moved the most men, the most ammunition, the most fuel, and the most steel, won. The shotgun didn't move anything. It was the end point of a much larger process, and therefore it remained on the sidelines. However, their presence on the battlefields, even without official recognition, served as a symbol of an American style of waging war, a pragmatic, adaptive style that was not concerned with glory, but with results. The shotgun was not a weapon of honor. It was a weapon of function. Japan, by not understanding it, revealed not only a tactical limitation, but also a cultural limitation. They could not see value in what did not fit the myth, and that was the real mistake. Not the contempt for the gun, but the refusal to accept that war had ceased to be about honor and had become about efficiency. Even so, the data does not lie. The absence of specific Japanese countermeasures against rifles did not cause an increase in casualties. There is no record of battles lost due to lack of preparation against this weapon. And so the question remains, did Japan make a mistake, or did you get it right without knowing it? Perhaps, as in so many aspects of war, the answer lies in the middle. The shotgun was a real threat, but not a central one. A tactical problem, but not a strategic one. A scare, not a collapse. And in this context, Japanese doctrine, as flawed as it was, did not pay the price for ignoring it. In the next chapter, this ambiguity will be put to the test when we explore the transition from the rifle to the European theater. Because, despite everything, the U.S. Army decided that she still had a role to play, and the metallic sound of pump action, once muffled by the jungle, would now echo among the ruins of German cities, where every corner hid an enemy, and every meter conquered needed a lead shot. If there was a type of combat where the rifle should shine, it was there. Narrow corridors, total darkness, breathing distance. Tunnel against tunnel, rock against blood. The doctrine clearly provided for this. Since 1942, American manuals for combat in confined areas have recommended the use of the shotgun in environments such as bunkers, caves, trenches, and collapsed urban centers. The logic was crystal clear. In situations where the enemy appears within 10 meters, the dispersion and impact power of the 12-gauge would guarantee total supremacy. But the battlefield, once again, had other plans. On Iwo Jima, more than 11,000 Japanese fortified positions were found. Between natural caves, hand-dug tunnels, and interlocking concrete bunkers, the island became an underground fortress. Theoretically, it was the perfect environment for the shotgun to operate. But in practice, the weapons chosen by the Marines were different. Flamethrowers, white phosphorus grenades, demolition charges, and tanks modified with pressurized napalm. The brutality of these combats did not allow room for precision. Every entry into a cave was a suicide bet. The Japanese dug positions with internal angles, crossed fields of fire and tunnels with multiple exits. When the Americans tried to enter, the response was immediate. Grenades, bursts of machine guns, bayonets in the dark. The use of the shotgun in these contexts, while technically possible, required full exposure of the shooter, something fatal against enemies prepared to die. Thus the American doctrine quickly adapted. Instead of entering, sealing. Instead of cleaning, burning. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice. Capable of reaching 40 meters away with continuous fire jets, they eliminated the need for hand-to-hand combat. All it took was a blast toward the opening, and everything inside turned to heat and smoke. It was less human, but more efficient. In Manila, the scenario was different, but the logic repeated itself. Narrow streets, crumbling buildings, stairwells, basements, and dead ends created the ideal environment for close-quarters combat. The shotgun has reappeared, now in more visible actions. Urban patrols, night operations, infiltrations in houses and warehouses. And in many accounts, it was used effectively. But even there, when Japanese resistance was entrenched, American units preferred a cocktail of destruction: grenades, portable flamethrowers, and even tanks in urban areas firing inside buildings. The priority was to preserve the attacker's life, and the shotgun, while powerful, required too much proximity. The promise of the shotgun as an urban assault weapon was therefore just that, a promise. In the reality of combat, she was left behind more ruthless solutions. The combat engineers carried explosives, the gunners destroyed entire buildings, and the scouts, when they could, avoided direct confrontation. The shotgun was used, yes, but always as a last layer, never as an opening of attack. It was the final blow, not the entry key, and this contradicted the doctrinal ideal that surrounded her. In many internal documents, the weapon was described as preferential for enclosed environments, great in urban combat, or superior at close ranges. But these compliments were not reflected in prominence. The reason, once again, lay in the nature of modern combat. World War II did not reward weapons that required individual courage. It rewarded tools that eliminated risk. The shotgun, to be effective, required the soldier to expose himself. It was necessary to enter, aim, shoot, and that, in bunkers and ruins, was asking to die. The Japanese knew this. Their defenses were designed to engage rifle firefighters, but at the same time, they harshly punished those who attempted short approaches. There were booby traps, blind chambers, snipers positioned at 45-degree angles, and every poorly planned entry cost lives. On Iwo Jima, for example, it took the Marines 36 days to take a 21-square-kilometer island, and lost nearly 7,000 men. The death rate was higher than in Normandy, and in that scenario, there was no room for tactical romanticism. It was killing from a distance or dying when entering. This reality was reflected in the distribution of weapons itself. Despite initial efforts, the Marine Corps and U.S. Army did not standardize the shotgun as an essential urban combat weapon. The emphasis was on semi-automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M3 grease gun, which allowed for a greater number of shots without direct exposure. The shotgun remained a complementary weapon, delivered to support units, patrols, and specific functions such as policing and escort. Its potential, although recognized, was contained by the logic of the field. And once again, military history shows that between the manual and reality, there is an abyss. The greatest example of this is in the distribution statistics. While millions of rifles and submachine guns were sent to Europe and the Pacific, only a tiny fraction of rifles reached the theater of operations. On Iwo Jima, where use would be theoretically optimal, fewer than 500 shotguns were registered in line units. In Okinawa, similar number. In contrast, in that year alone, the U.S. produced more than 400,000 M1 rifles and more than 100,000 Thompson submachine guns. The numbers speak for themselves. The doctrine bet, but the logistics and the battlefield bet differently, and they won. Even with this practical erasure, the image of the shotgun persisted, as a symbol of controlled brutality, of close combat, of direct force. But it was an image built more on expectation than on experience. It represented an ideal that rarely came to fruition. It was evoked as a solution for closed environments, but avoided when the real situation demanded ruthless decisions. War in the end was not won with the best tool, but with the one that required the least sacrifice from those who wielded it. And, in this criterion, the shotgun lost. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the factories and understand why, even with their limited use, the United States continued to produce military rifles on a large scale. The answer lies not only in the battlefield, but in contracts, in the industrial chain, and in the logic of a war increasingly made by spreadsheets. Because to understand the presence of a weapon in war, sometimes it is necessary to look not at the field, but for the office. Modern warfare is not won with weapons, strategy, or courage alone. It is defeated with mathematics. And in the Pacific, that math began in the hold of transport ships where every cubic inch decided who lived, who died, and what kind of weaponry would reach the Marines on the front lines. The 12-gauge shotgun, powerful at close range, suffered in the face of this invisible reality. One shotgun shell took up the space of 3 rifle shells and weighed almost twice as much. This meant that for every box of 25 shells sent to the Pacific, it was necessary to sacrifice space that could carry 75 rounds of Garand, or additional tapes for Browning machine guns. In a war where each island required tons of ammunition transported thousands of miles, the arithmetic was ruthless. The devastating power of the shotgun did not compensate for its logistical inefficiency. On amphibious assault ships, cargo officers had to make choices: more .30-06 ammunition to sustain prolonged fire, or a few 12-gauge boxes intended for a few specialists. In almost all operations, the choice fell on what kept the infantry alive the longest. The logic was not emotional. It was accounting. Battles in the Pacific consumed ammunition at frightening rates. On Guadalcanal, Marine units fired an average of 15,000 rifle rounds per day of intense combat. On Iwo Jima, the machine guns positioned in the forward line consumed more than 500,000 shells in the first 48 hours alone. Against numbers like this, the rifle disappeared from the priorities. Its bulky cartridges did not power machine guns, did not sustain defensive barrages, offered no range. They were useful only at very specific moments, and those moments did not justify the precious tonnage they occupied on the ships. This reality also affected the individual combatant. The rifleman carrying a shotgun was limited. In his backpack, he could carry about 36 12-gauge cartridges. The same space would hold 80 rifle cartridges. In the sweltering heat of the jungle, every gram made a difference. On patrols that lasted for days, the ability to maintain sustained fire was crucial. The shotgun did not offer that. It was a weapon of immediate impact, not of continuity. The commanders knew. And so, even if they admired their effectiveness in close combat, they avoided assigning shotguns to essential functions. War requires redundancy. The shotgun offered explosion, not permanence. Air logistics reinforced this difference. C-47 planes, essential for dropping supplies in isolated areas, had strict weight limits. A poorly chosen cargo could mean less ration, less water, less vital ammunition. Within these calculations, shotgun shells rarely appeared. There was no room for tactical sentimentality when the equation was literal. More weight equaled less life. And so, even before combat, the shotgun lost ground to weapons that offered more shots per kilogram carried. It was a defeat before the battle. At the industrial level, the situation was similar. American ammunition production during the war was gigantic. Billions of rifle rounds, hundreds of millions for machine guns, millions for mortars. By comparison, shotgun shells were manufactured on a modest scale. The country had the necessary capacity to produce more, but it did not have the incentive. Armaments Department reports classified the shotgun as an auxiliary weapon, while the rifle and machine gun were described as fundamental sustaining weapons. And when the dispute for brass arose, essential also for artillery hulls and electrical components, the rifle lost priority. The impact of this was direct. Less ammunition available means less adoption in the field. This brutal arithmetic also explains why the late adoption of M19 brass cartridges in 1945 did not alter the outlook. The problem wasn't just reliability, it was the logistical cost of maintaining a low-impact strategic weapon. Why send hundreds of pounds of shotgun ammunition to a remote island if the same space could carry enough ammunition to feed an entire platoon? Modern warfare favors weapons that multiply force. The shotgun multiplied the fright, not the efficiency. Even so, she remained present, on bases, convoys, rear patrols, and specific actions. His psychological role was undeniable, but under the cold lens of logistics, its presence was an operational luxury that only a country with the industrial capacity of the United States could maintain. And here comes the irony that few realize. While Germany struggled to supply entire divisions with enough ammunition to sustain an offensive for 3 days, the United States had enough production to manufacture and ship thousands of rifles that would never become central to the fighting. This disparity reveals the true difference between the powers. While the Germans tallied each grenade, the Americans could experiment, test, distribute, and even waste niche weapons, and still win. But this logistical inequality also holds a revelation. Even with all the American industrial power, even with huge ships and almost unlimited production capacity, the shotgun did not find space. And if a powerful weapon cannot justify itself within abundant logistics, what does this say about its strategic relevance? In the next chapter, we'll explore just that, and see how the absence of Japanese protests and countermeasures was not neglect, but a symptom of something bigger, the weapon that no one feared, because in the end, it never really threatened to change the course of the war. In 1945, when the Allies began compiling the documents captured from the Imperial Japanese Army, one expected to find detailed explanations of the strategies, tactics, and above all, the threats faced in the jungles of the Pacific, and they were there. There were extensive manuals on how to resist flamethrower attacks, calculations of dispersion of fire from Browning machine guns, procedures for neutralizing low-altitude air attacks, techniques for outsmarting tanks, camouflage against air observers, even instructions on how to deal with the psychological impact of continuous naval bombardments. But amidst hundreds of tactical pages, there was not a single mention of American 12-gauge shotguns, not a single line, not a footnote, not even a warning for recognition or precaution, nothing. This silence, far from being accidental, is a clear symptom of how Japanese doctrine saw, or more accurately, did not see, this weapon. In Japanese military thought, forged between millennial traditions and selective modern influences, only that which required changes was relevant. Machine guns demanded dispersion, grenades, cover, flamethrower, distance, bombings, excavation. The shotgun, because it did not alter the enemy's behavior, was simply invisible, and at this point, Japanese silence becomes a diagnosis. The weapon existed in the field, but it did not impact doctrine. In post-war interrogations conducted by U.S. officers, the pattern was repeated. When asked which American weapons they feared most, the Japanese prisoners listed the air raids, artillery fire, flamethrowers, and occasionally light mortars. The shotgun, again, was ignored. Even soldiers who had fought on Guadalcanal or Saipan could not describe the weapon clearly. Many could not even differentiate its sound from a submachine gun. Others simply classified it as a sentry gun. This reveals a dangerous but revealing perception. For the enemy, the shotgun was not a tool of attack but a side noise, present but irrelevant. This contempt was not exclusive to the countryside. In the Imperial tactical manuals, meticulously drafted by high-ranking officers, the shotguns appear neither in the Allied armament sections nor in the parts devoted to engagement instructions. In contrast, the Thompson are described in detail, the Garand rifles analyzed in depth. Even white phosphorus grenades receive specific attention. The absence of the shotguns indicates that, even in the face of their physical presence, they were not perceived as transforming elements of the battlefield. And this brings us to one of the central ironies of this story. In the United States, the shotgun was romantically remembered as a symbol of proximate brutality, of intimate war, while in Japan it did not even deserve a note. This dichotomy between memory and real perception is reinforced by numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. produced approximately 100,000 military rifles. Even though only half were sent to the Pacific, that's a significant presence. However, none of these weapons forced any Japanese adaptation. By comparison, the mere introduction of flamethrowers brought about drastic changes in bunker construction, with ventilation channels, dual exits, and counterattack positions. The shotguns, as much as they caused occasional casualties, did not cause a single doctrinal adjustment. They did not alter trenches, patrols, or the architecture of the defenses. And here, a technical pause is appropriate. In terms of firepower at close range, The shotgun with buckshot .00 ammunition is equivalent to firing 9.33 rounds in a single shot, with wide dispersion. At 6 meters, this gust is devastating, and yet, it was ignored. The reason? Simple. This type of combat rarely decided battles. Campaigns in the Pacific were fought on a large scale, with air, logistical, and naval dominance. The shotguns operated on such a narrow tactical plane that their consequences never went beyond the local level. They were effective, but inconsequential, noisy, but silent in strategic terms. And when we look back at the American accounts, the distance grows even more. Movies, games, books, and popular culture manuals have turned the shotgun into an iconic weapon. In narratives of urban combat, it has become a symbol of tactical aggressiveness, of combat without rules. But on the other end of the line, in Japan, it never existed as a concept. It was a weapon without an enemy, a ghost without presence. The culmination of this forgetfulness appears in the post-war analyses of the Japanese General Staff itself. In several reports on failures in the Pacific Campaign, there are long sections on the inability to contain tanks, on the impact of naval artillery, and on the ineffectiveness of night tactics. Not a single line, absolutely not, mentions the need to develop countermeasures for close-quarters combat with weapons such as rifles. The Japanese doctrine was defeated by the American industrial and technological reality, but not by this specific weapon. The shotgun was ignored, and paradoxically, perhaps rightly so. And this is where a number comes into play, revealing more than 1,000 analyses. While Japan produced about 6 million small arms during the entire war, the United States delivered more than 12 million rifles and submachine guns alone, not counting rifles. If this data surprises you, comment with absolute power. It sums up why the enemy did not react to every American tactical novelty, simply because it could not keep up either in quantity or in industrial elasticity. This absence of response is not a sign of wisdom. It is a symptom of exhaustion. Japan was fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century logistical structure, and yet another surrender disguised as pride. In the next chapter, we will dive into just that, how the American doctrine itself, while recognizing the limits of the shotgun, decided to keep it in use until the end, not out of necessity, but by excess, because in the war of abundance, even what is useless can be distributed. While Japan recycled artillery parts to make improvised anti-tank rifles, the United States produced shotguns on an industrial scale without knowing exactly where or when to use them. The contrast between scarcity and excess has never been clearer than in the war's production spreadsheets. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 100,000 12-gauge shotguns were manufactured by 4 giants of American industry: Winchester, Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca, adapted models with shortened barrels, reinforced stocks and bayonet fittings, weapons designed for close combat, for trenches, caves, alleys, forests, and yet, most of them have never seen direct combat. They were assigned to guard posts, convoys, prisoner security, recruit training, and perimeter base patrols. Rear weapons in a war with no defined rearguard, the American Army, swamped by its own industrial capacity, became a victim of its own abundance. The problem was never to produce, it was deciding what to do with what was already ready. And in this scenario, the rifle emerged as a symbol of a pragmatic doctrine that sometimes erred on the side of the mark. They manufactured because they could, they distributed because there was leftover, and when the weapon arrived at the front, they discovered that it was not useless, but neither is it essential. On Guadalcanal, some units requisitioned her for night defense. On Iwo Jima, scattered reports of its use on patrols emerge, but never at scale, never as a centerpiece. The shotgun was reliable, easy to handle, terrifying at close range, but its use required extreme proximity, and modern warfare deviated from this model. The tactic was to dominate before touching, attack with grenades, machine guns, aerial fire. The shotgun belonged to a style of combat that the 20th century was burying, and even then it was produced in numbers that exceeded the total number of German MP-40 submachine guns manufactured during the entire war. Yes, the United States has made more 12-gauge military rifles than the Third Reich has been able to make of its most iconic tactical weapon. If this surprises you, comment on shocking data. This discrepancy reveals an uncomfortable truth. While Germany produced what it could use, the U.S. produced what it wanted, and then dealt with the fate of that arsenal. American logistics was so broad, so redundant, that it allowed for errors on an industrial scale without collapsing the system. What in any other army would have been a fatal waste, in the hands of the Americans was only a manageable variable. The 12-gauge shotgun, in this sense, is not a symbol of failure. It is proof of logistical luxury, a product of a machine that manufactured more than the field could absorb. Tactical employment records reinforce this idea. Rarely does a formal unit equipped with rifles appear as its main weapon. The pattern was different. Weapons distributed individually to sentries, patrolmen, military police, and officers at outposts. The rifle served more as a deterrent than a direct combat element. It was powerful, but not integrated into the doctrine of fire and maneuver. His role, while useful, was peripheral, and even this was only possible because American industry allowed it. No other nation at war could afford to manufacture thousands of weapons with marginal tactical impact. Japan, for example, was barely able to keep its production of Arisaka rifles stable during the final years of the conflict. In 1944, some of the new Japanese recruits were still training with bamboo spears. This abundance generated not only excess, but dispersion. Many shotguns never left the American continent. They were allocated to coastal bases, rail escorts, border patrols. Others were sent to Allied countries under the Lend-Lease Act. There are records of American shotguns operating in the European theater in British hands, especially in security and containment actions, which reveals another layer to this story. American weaponry was not just a military resource. It was a diplomatic tool, a sign of capability. Overproducing allowed weapons to be sent to allies without compromising one's own stockpile. And even if they were weapons of limited tactical impact, such as the shotgun, their delivery symbolized strength, support, presence. However, this volume also created paradoxes. In some direct combat units, spare parts for machine guns were lacking. In others, there were shotguns left without adequate ammunition. The system was vast, but not always efficient. The industrialization of warfare had turned the battlefield into a spreadsheet, and error was now counted in tons, not decisions. Producing 100,000 rifles seemed logical in 1942 when the war was booming. But by 1945, when needs had adjusted, thousands of them lay in warehouses, with no clear destination. Some have been recycled, others sold to civilians, others destroyed. The weapon that was born for the front ended its journey in a warehouse in Utah, far from the Pacific, far from Europe, far from war. This trajectory reinforces the central thesis. American industrial superiority was incontestable, but it also revealed a paradox. Because the same machine that created solutions could generate inefficiencies, absolute power allowed mistakes without punishment. The rifle was one of these anomalies. Effective but not essential, mass-produced but used in a niche, remembered with fear in movies but forgotten in manuals. It existed. She killed, but he never commanded. And that makes it even more symbolic. A weapon born of excess, a survivor of pragmatism, a shadow of a system that, even without knowing exactly what to do with it, could afford to keep it. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this same industrial power decided to bring the shotgun to the European front, and what happened when the jungle weapon was unleashed on the narrow streets of Normandy and the ruins of Aachen. Because for the American war machine, every weapon deserved a second chance, even the one that no one had asked for. In the military archives, the American rifle appears little. In the combat reports, almost nothing. In the officers' diaries, sparse mentions, often linked to secondary functions. And yet, for millions of people around the world, this was the jungle weapon. The image crystallized in the collective imagination is almost always the same. The Marine covered in mud, advancing through the dense vegetation, the 12-gauge rifle in hand, ready to fire in slam fire. A low metallic sound, the rumble that breaks the green silence. That image, while powerful, was shaped more by Hollywood than by Henderson Field, more by screenwriters than by quartermaster officers. And what popular culture has consecrated as an icon, historical records treat as a footnote. The phenomenon is not new. The war, once over, no longer belongs only to those who fought it. It also belongs to those who retell it. And in reconstructing American memory over the Pacific, the shotgun has found its role, not in logistical spreadsheets but on movie screens. Films such as The Longest of Days, Born to Kill and The Peacemaker helped to sculpt the figure of the brutal, close, ruthless soldier, armed with an instrument of direct violence and without mediation. The shotgun was cinematic. Each shot was visual, visceral, audible. It was easy to understand, easy to film, easy to remember. The Garand required aim. The bar was heavy, the flamethrower was slow. The shotgun does not. She spoke for herself. In games, the pattern was repeated. Titles such as Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, World at War, and Battlefield 1942 put the shotgun in the hands of players as a weapon of impact and proximity. Within the digital logic, it became a tactical choice, devastating at close range, useless at medium. This simplification found an emotional echo in the audience. It was the weapon of close duels, of eye-to-eye combat, of the jungle where the enemy is one step away. And so the myth was formed. The weapon forgotten by the reports became the most recognizable symbol of jungle warfare, not because it was used en masse, but because the narrative needed it. At collectors' fairs and veterans' gatherings, this contrast is clearly revealed. Many Marines who have been to Guadalcanal or Peleliu do not even remember seeing a shotgun at the front. Others remember it as a patrol weapon or base guard. Almost none describe it as an essential piece. And even so, when miniatures, paintings, posters, and replicas are sold, the rifle is always there, in the foreground, as if she had been the silent heroine of the campaign, as if he were in every ambush, in every trench, in every night advance. This dissonance reveals a truth about how war is told. Numbers don't win out over the narrative. Repetition builds more memory than statistics. This rewrite, however, is not only American. Even in Japan, post-war accounts rarely mention the shotgun. But in manga, movies, and historical series, it begins to appear in the hands of American sentries and soldiers. The invisible weapon came into existence in the rear-view mirror of fiction. What was absent in Doctrine has become present in symbolism. The brutality of the slam fire, which left the barrel smoking and the projectiles devastated the vegetation, became synonymous with combat in the Pacific. And so, little by little, the rifle ceased to be what it was, to become what they needed her to be. This distortion is not a memory error. It is a process of cultural construction. And in post-war times, when the nation seeks to understand the trauma experienced, visual symbols take on a therapeutic function. The shotgun was a metaphor of raw power, of direct warfare, of instinctive response. It represented the soldier who did not wait for orders, only reaction. And for this reason, even though it was absent on many fronts, it was rescued as an emblem. A weapon that, although it did not win battles, won in the narrative. That's what turned her into a myth, her ability to fit into any story. But the data don't lie. In the U.S., Ordnance Department's distribution records, the number of shotguns sent to combat zones is expressive, but never dominant. Among the millions of rifles, submachine guns, and automatic weapons shipped to the Pacific, shotguns accounted for a fraction. And even among these, part remained in deposits, part was designated for secondary uses. The training manuals of the time mention the use of the shotgun, but with an emphasis on security missions, not trench assault. Operational reality never gave it the status that cinema gave it. It was useful but not indispensable, lethal but not strategic. The irony is that by winning in the cinema, the shotgun recalibrated the collective memory. Many veterans, decades later, when watching movies or playing games, began to reconstruct their memories in the light of this representation. The human brain fills in gaps, and when the image is repeated enough, it replaces the real. The weapon that was not decisive became a symbol, and the symbol went on to rewrite the war. This phenomenon is especially revealing because it dismantles a common belief that history is made only by facts. In fact, history is also made by those who tell these facts. And in many cases, what remains is not what was used the most, but what was most remembered. The shotgun won by symbolic presence. It filled a narrative void, and in times of total war, even absences need a face. She offered that face, and with it, it occupied the space that the reports had left blank. In the next chapter, we return to the hard data. We will reveal how the American logistics machine, even aware of the tactical underuse of the shotgun, decided to keep it in production until the end of the conflict. Because for the United States, war wasn't just about beating the enemy. It was about making sure that no soldier was left without an option, even if that option was statistically unnecessary. In the midst of millions of reports, there are silences. But there are also rare voices that escape the noise of official history. Marines who held 12-gauge shotguns and knew exactly what they had in their hands. They don't appear in the movies. Their names are not in manuals. But his words survive in letters, interviews, and memories preserved in scattered archives. They are simple, direct reports, devoid of heroism. One of them, by Private Harold McCluskey, describes a night patrol on Bougainville. The moon was covered, we only heard the crickets. And the bush moved. Nobody saw anything. And then when I fired, it was as if the forest had exploded. McCluskey didn't have a Garand. It had a Winchester M97 shotgun, loaded with .00 buck ammunition. And that night, according to him, it was she who brought him back alive. These isolated testimonies reveal a tactical pattern that the reports ignored. The rifle was not a weapon of advancement. It was a weapon of reaction. Ideal for when the enemy had already infiltrated, for when visibility was zero and combat took place within a few meters. In these situations, the ability to fire 6 buckshot shells in 2 seconds made all the difference. As another veteran described, she didn't have to aim. I needed to point it out and pray. It was therefore a weapon that, although technically primitive, filled a void that no other covered, that of the instinctive, immediate, violent response in an environment where hesitating meant dying. Sergeant Paul G. Saunders, who fought in the Philippines, reported that he requisitioned a shotgun for night patrols after losing 2 men in ambushes. With the M1, you need to see it. With the shotgun, you need to feel it. This difference between seeing and feeling defines the symbolic role of the weapon. It was not accurate. It was one of perception. Its effectiveness came from instinct, from reaction, from psychological impact. Many veterans point out that just the sound of the bomb action, the famous pump, was enough to freeze the jungle. It was like a warning that, from then on, hell would begin. It is curious that, even among those who praise the shotgun, almost everyone recognizes its limitations. Locked. It warped with humidity. The ammunition was heavy. The cadence, although intense, was short. But even then, there were situations in which no other weapon replaced his presence. The reports coincide: ambushes, closed clearings, tunnel entrances, perimeter security, situations where the rifle not only adapted, dominated. A flamethrower operator needed cover. A Marine with a shotgun offered this in 3 seconds. An outpost sentry preferred a shotgun to bar. Why? Because I didn't need to see the whole enemy. I just needed to get right where he was coming from. The shotgun, then, found its role not in planning, but in improvisation. It was the weapon of necessity. When there was a lack of vision, when adrenaline was over, when combat had already invaded the soldier's intimate space, it was the one that remained. And so those who used it knew what they had. It was not a modern weapon of war. It was an extension of survival. Sergeant Edward Langley, in a 1972 interview, summed it up. In the jungle, time did not exist, only the distance. And if it were short, I was grateful to have a shotgun. These accounts, though scarce, reveal the difference between the war of generals and the war of men. While the planners discussed doctrine, transport, rate of fire, and armor penetration, the soldier in the woods just wanted a gun that didn't miss. And in this criterion, the shotgun, no matter how marginal it was in the supply chain, delivered what it promised. With simplicity, with brutality, with economy of movement. It was the weapon of the final seconds, of the combat that no one planned, but that everyone feared. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The shotgun didn't need fancy adaptations or technological upgrades. It was what it was, and in certain contexts, it was all that was needed. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The tactical reconnaissance of the shotgun, however, did not arrive in time to change its institutional image. It continued to be seen as a second-line weapon, and even the veterans who defend it do so with a dose of resignation. They knew she was not glorious, but they also knew that between being alive or dead, glory was irrelevant. The shotgun for them was a silent companion, effective when all else failed, when the troops dispersed, when the radio did not respond, when the bush swallowed everything. It was at that moment that she justified herself. Perhaps that's why, even with all the limitations, she left such vivid memories in so few men, because when the shotgun was used, it scored. Its impact was sensory, visual, auditory, physical. The enemy's body did not fall. It was torn from position. The sound of the slamfire didn't echo, it exploded. The surrounding field did not react, and it was silent. It was an abrupt, cutting, final presence. And in the uncertain world of the jungle, that was gold. These voices do not rewrite the war, but they add forgotten nuances. They show that even among the excess there was purpose. Even among the silence of the archives there was survival. And even in the smaller guns there were great stories. Stories that don't fit in spreadsheets, but that fit in every step taken back home. Because for the Marine who braved the darkness with a shotgun in his hand, it doesn't matter what the manuals say. He knows that, in that moment, she made a difference. In the next chapter, we will get to the heart of this irony. The order to maintain the production of the rifle until the end of the war, even when the data already proved its underuse. Because, for the United States, having too much was better than lacking. And for some, this excess was exactly what kept them alive. If modern warfare has a language of its own, its verbs are dictated by doctrine. And in the jungles of the Pacific, the grammar of combat was rewritten not for romanticism but for efficiency. While the shotgun appeared punctually, carried by sentries, scouts, or PMs, two weapons emerged as tactical pillars of the American offensive: the BAR, Browning automatic rifle, and the M2 flamethrower. Together they formed the new lexicon of short, close, devastating war. The BAR, with its 20-round magazine and rate of up to 500 rounds per minute, provided continuous fire in advance. The flamethrower, with its 20 to 40-meter jet of fire, not only eliminated resistance, but terrified. And it was this combination, volume and fear, that shaped the official doctrine for jungle combat. In infantry manuals issued between 1943 and 1945, the structure of the American squadron was adapted to revolve around the BAR operator. He was not a complement, he was the axis. On patrols, the BAR advanced in the center. In ambushes, he covered the rear. During attacks on entrenched positions, he prepared the advance of the men with flamethrowers. It was a synergy designed, trained, and replicated on the field. Each platoon knew exactly who did what. The doctrine left no room for improvisation. The goal was simple: maximum efficiency with minimum exposure time. And in this tactical ecosystem, the shotgun has found no place. It was good in specific situations, but it was not part of the maneuver flows, nor the doctrinal diagrams. There was no defined role for her in a coordinated advance. She didn't sustain fire. She didn't clear caves accurately. She didn't win duels against light machine guns. In the game of tactical dominance, it lacked range and volume. While the BAR fired at 400 meters and the flamethrower swept 30 meters with heat, the rifle stopped at 20 meters. It was a weapon of survival, not of conquest. And in the jungle, where every move had to have a strategic consequence, that made all the difference. Logistics also consecrated this hierarchy. Supply chains prioritized rifle ammunition and flamethrower fuel. The 30 caliber cartridge boxes traveled in protected convoys. 12-gauge cartridges, especially paper ones, often did not even ship. In reports from 1944, quartermaster officials suggested further limiting shipments of shotgun ammunition, not because of weapon failures, but because of tactical irrelevance. The doctrine had already decided, and what was not part of it did not gain priority. The case of the flamethrower is particularly emblematic. Initially considered a supporting weapon, it was quickly promoted to instrument of rupture. On Iwo Jima, 40% of the caves were neutralized by flamethrowers. In Okinawa, the statistics are repeated. American doctrine understood that against an entrenched enemy willing to die, it was not enough to displace him. It was necessary to incinerate him. The brutality of the M2 became operational policy. The specialized units were expanded. Sherman tanks began to receive versions with integrated flamethrowers. It was the institutional recognition that, in total war, there was no room for half measures. The BAR, in turn, has become a symbol of individual firepower. It was heavy, more than 8 kilos loaded, but its ability to suppress the advancing enemy was worth the effort. BAR operators were given extra training, logistical privileges, and often tactical respect. They paved the way. They provided cover. They created windows of opportunity. And so every advance into hostile terrain began with a BAR shot, followed by a short run and more shots. The pace of the squad was dictated by this cadence, and in this scenario, the rifle was mute. He was out of the symphony. The victorious doctrine, therefore, was not the one that bet on exotic weapons or visual symbolism. It was the one that integrated its tools into the logistics flow, standardized training, and strategic repetition. The bar and flamethrower won not only by force, but for the function. They were planned, distributed, used, and reinforced with method. The shotgun, on the contrary, remained as a footnote, used where it fit, forgotten where it didn't fit, and that difference sealed his fate. That is why, at the end of the war, when commanders drafted final reports and compiled lessons learned, mentions of the bar and the flamethrower took up entire pages. The shotgun, when mentioned, came in parentheses. As an exception, as a curiosity, a major in the 6th Marine Division wrote in his field report, "The bar was the backbone of the platoon, the flamethrower, the fist, and the shotgun, an occasional punch." This image sums up the tactical reality. A gun can be powerful, but if it is not integrated into the doctrine, it disappears. It becomes a legend, or worse, it becomes a manual illustration. Even so, the American industrial machine continued to produce shotguns until the end of the conflict, not because of strategic insistence, but because of capacity to spare. The production lines of Ithaca, Remington, and Stevens did not have to stop, and as there was steel, labor, and transportation, why not continue? It was the logistical luxury of a nation that could produce what it did not need. While Japan repurposed helmets as pots, the U.S. manufactured weapons for functions that no longer existed. The contrast was not just material, he was philosophical, a doctrine that could err in excess but never by omission, and it was this abundance that shaped the post-war period. When arsenals were dismantled and surpluses sold, millions of American guns circulated around the world, including shotguns. They ended up in police forces, hunters, collectors. They became a symbol of the Second World War, not for tactical merit, but for symbolic survival. They were available, they were iconic, and so they rewrote their own history. In the next chapter, we'll take a final dive into the production and distribution archives to reveal a statistic that few know: how many of these shotguns were manufactured, and how many were actually fired in combat. Because, in the end, what defines the importance of a weapon is not its potency, it is its presence, and they do not always coincide. August 1945. As the world watched smoke rise over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another operation, silent but monumental, was being dismantled behind the scenes of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was Operation Downfall, the meticulously constructed plan to invade the Japanese archipelago in 2 phases, Olympic and Coronet. A catastrophic human cost was estimated, up to 1 million Allied casualties, according to the most pessimistic projections. And in this calculation of horror, where every meter of urban terrain would be disputed between houses, temples, and alleys, the 12-gauge rifle finally gained a place of prominence. For the first time since Guadalcanal, she would not be a supporting actor. Supply orders for the invasion included thousands of short-barreled shotguns, now equipped with moisture-resistant brass cartridges, with revised training and clear tactical plans. The scenario was ideal: urban combat, minimal visibility, enemy entrenched among civilians. Doctrines were rewritten to incorporate the weapon as the primary vector in forced entries, night patrols, and inland combat. Each rifle and infantry division that would participate in the invasion would have a full platoon armed with shotguns. For the first time, the U.S. Army acknowledged in official documents that confined space combat favored not the sniper rifle, but the immediate impact and dispersion of the 12-gauge. The July 1945 infantry manual included specific instructions for the use of the shotgun in corridors, stairwells, and small compartments. It was the right weapon, in the right place, at the almost right time. But the war was over. The Japanese surrender, precipitated by nuclear bombing and the Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific conflict, canceled Operation Downfall. Ships that were ready to set sail with thousands of tons of equipment were emptied. Warehouses that hoarded newly manufactured shotguns from Remington and Ithaca, now with moisture-proof cartridges, were closed. The entire logistical structure that had finally converged to give the shotgun its chance for tactical impact was paralyzed. The long-requested and long-awaited brass ammunition arrived too late. An arsenal of potential was condemned to inactivity. A doctrinal plan was shelved before it could be tested, and a weapon, whose moment of glory seemed inevitable, was marked by what could have been, and not by what was. The curious thing is that reports from the time demonstrate a rare technical enthusiasm for a weapon that was previously marginalized. In planning documents of the 6th Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division, shotguns appear as a key piece of combat in Okinawa, Sasebo, and even on the streets of Tokyo in case of armed resistance after surrender. An excerpt from Lieutenant Colonel John C. Messenger's report describes, "We expect endurance in densely built environments, with visibility of less than 15 meters. The most suitable weapon will be the short-barreled shotgun with a 00 lead cartridge." These predictions, although never put into practice, show a profound change in perception. The weapon that was once seen as an accessory was now described as essential for the first line of contact in hostile urban areas. The irony of this story lies in its logistical crudeness. The U.S. Army did not fail to realize the tactical value of the shotgun. It just took too long to treat it with the seriousness it demanded. When the doctrinal, industrial, and operational elements were finally aligned, the battlefield evaporated. Hiroshima and Nagasaki destroyed cities, yes, but they also destroyed plans. By the time Japan announced its surrender, more than 40,000 shotguns were ready for shipment. Thousands of brass cartridges had already been packed in sealed boxes to withstand the humidity of the Japanese coast, and hundreds of Marines had completed specific training for urban combat with shotguns. None of this was used, but the numbers remained. In the logistical report of September 1945, it is stated, "Available stock, 47,250 M12 model rifles, 12-gauge ammunition, brass cartridge, 230,000 units. It is a considerable arsenal, and everything was saved, redistributed, or discarded." The tactical history of the shotgun, which had been written with hesitation since 1942, had its conclusion interrupted by an atomic flash. The operation that would make it the centerpiece of the urban assault doctrine was canceled by surrender, not obsolescence. And this creates a rare kind of military memory, the memory of a war that did not happen, a battle drawn on maps, rehearsed in training camps fueled by factories, but never fought. The impact of this absence echoes even today. In post-war analyses, military historians rarely mention the shotgun when discussing Japan's invasion doctrine, and yet, she was at the heart of the plan. The subsequent silence is not a reflection of its insignificance but of the tactical frustration of an aborted narrative. The gun was ready, the doctrine was written, the enemy was in position, but the trigger was not pulled. A war that did not occur became the grave of the shotgun as a frontline military weapon. This logistical frustration reveals more than a time failure. It reveals the essence of modern military planning, a dance between prediction and reality, between desire and execution. The shotgun, a symbol of straightforward brutality and lethal simplicity, has been pushed to the brink of glory and forgotten at the moment of victory, not through fault, not by mistake, but for excess of power elsewhere. As she awaited her day in the basements of Pearl Harbor, 2 bombs fell on Japan, ending the war before it could begin. And if the reader still doubts the scale of this preparation, consider the following number. Between March and July 1945, more than 18,000 Model 12 rifles were produced exclusively for Operation Downfall. It was an average of 120 per working day, an entire production line dedicated to a weapon that never saw combat, a testimony of what could have been a new phase in urban warfare, and one that fell apart with the signing of a surrender. In the next part, we will explore the ultimate fate of these shotguns and how they ended up influencing future conflicts, not in the Pacific, but in the hands of police officers, soldiers from other wars, and especially in post-war visual culture. Because the sound that echoed in the jungles of the Pacific, it still resonates decades later in the canvases and memories that choose to remember what never happened. Military history likes winners, of the weapons that changed battles, of the equipment that defined doctrines, from the metallic sound of the decisive gear. But there is a silent, forgotten field where there are not the celebrated rifles, the iconic tanks, or the planes that tore through the skies. There are the tools of vigil, patrol, rearguard. The 12-gauge military rifle in World War II lived in exactly this limbo, effective enough to use, too modest to remember. And this forgetting reveals more about the memory of the war than any production statistics. Because behind each advance there was a perimeter to be protected. Behind each landing, a sentry armed with a short barrel and 6 buckshot cartridges, waiting for the wrong move in the bush. And behind each heroic narrative, there was a soldier on guard, alone, waiting for the night to pass. In the warehouses of Pearl Harbor and the docks of California, thousands of shotguns were reshipped, redistributed, or retired after 1945. Some ended up in military prisons, others in the hands of the naval police, and hundreds were sold as surplus, recycled as civilian weapons. But among veterans, few detailed memories have survived, not because the gun didn't matter, but because its function was never to conquer. It was to hold on, to protect, to be there when nothing else was. An armed presence in canteens, checkpoints, makeshift dormitories. In Okinawa, there are reports of scouts only carrying shotguns during the night patrol. They didn't go to the front line, but it was the front eyes. Without them, there was no progress, just an ambush. And it is at this point that the shotgun reveals its silent importance. It did not transform the tactics, but maintain the structure. It was the tool of the unseduced, of those who were in the shadow of grenade launchers and heavy machine guns. In the documents of the 3rd Marine Division, for example, there are records of cleaning patrols using shotguns after confrontations to check buildings, caves, and hiding places. They were not on the offensive. They were behind, cleaning up what was left. But without this rear guard, the advance collapsed. This type of function rarely appears in movies or books, because it is not glorious. It is methodical, everyday, tense in its repetition, but it is also the backbone of any sustained operation. And here comes the cruel irony. By forgetting the rifle, we also forget the men who carried it. Not the generals, not the medal heroes, but the ones who stayed awake on guard shifts, the ones who opened the trail in the jungle before the battalion passed, those who watched the perimeter of the camp while the world slept. For them, the shotgun was the link between fear and duty, a short barrel, a menacing sound, and the hope that it would be enough to avoid contact. Modern warfare was won by industrial machines, yes, by ruthless logistics, for aggressive doctrines and impact weapons, but also by invisible layers of support, made up of smaller equipment and functions that the narrative prefers to ignore. The shotgun, in this context, is a symbol of what is not said, of what is not celebrated, but that sustains the whole. And that is why, in retelling his trajectory, we also retell the story of those who did not have space in the main pages of victory. Because victory, unlike glory, is built on the details. The absence of the shotgun in the collective memory is more a reflection of our selective relationship with history than a judgment on its effectiveness. Myths prefer the strength of the M1 rifle, the noise of the Thompson, the fire of the flamethrower, but none of these instruments would make sense without the layers of security and support that the shotgun represented. What's more, his very presence reveals an American strength that transcends the battlefield, the ability to produce not only what is necessary, but also what is possible, to set up all the functions, to predict all scenarios, to cover, with steel and brass, even the most unlikely corners of war. As we look at the reports of shotgun allocation at the end of the war, we see their use in ports, field hospitals, landing zones, and prison camps, places that rarely become the focus of military narratives, but that are vital to the functioning of the war effort. Without a sentinel, there is no rest. Without a lookout, there is no refueling. Without a perimeter, there is no command. Each shotgun at one of these points represented not only safety but continuity, the gear working even outside the firing line. This is the war we rarely remember, the one that happens between battles, the one that sustains the offensive with silence, not with explosions. And it is this war that the rifle fought, not with death statistics, but with the absence of incidents, not with glory but with prevention. Each night that nothing happened is perhaps due more to the presence of a soldier with a rifle than to any high-level strategy. And if today the memory of this weapon dissolves between cultural exaggerations and historical omissions, perhaps it is time to regain its place, not as a myth, but as a symbol of the forgotten function, because wars, in the end, are not won only by those who advance, but also for those who stay, that protect, that sustain. In the next part, we'll end this journey with the final reflection. What this weapon, simple, direct, and often ignored, teaches us about war, memory, and the way we choose to remember the past. Because to understand the silence around the rifle, is also to understand the limits and choices of military historiography itself. At the end of all the logistical, technological, and moral storm that defined the Second Pacific War, the truth remains crystal clear. The Japanese infantry, shaped by an ancestral doctrine of honor and hand-to-hand combat, never saw the sound of a 12-gauge rifle bursting out of the woods. And yet it wasn't this rumble that sealed his fate. It was American industrial silence, the muffled noise of factories that wouldn't stop, assembly lines that delivered more than necessary, and a doctrine that adapted every resource to the theater of war, no matter how improbable. The military rifle in this context did not win battles, did not write victories, but symbolized what Japan did not see coming: modern warfare as an impersonal, redundant, and absolutely pragmatic system. The collapse was not caused by weapons, but by a vision of war that no longer fit in the 20th century. And this is where the universal lesson arises. In war, it is not the one who has the most lethal weapon who wins, but the one who has the most adaptable system. The arsenal isolated does not decide. It is the invisible link between production, transportation, training, doctrine, and redundancy that transforms equipment into results. The rifle, with all its flaws and promises, was just another link, modest but functional, in an apparatus that knew that winning was not just advancing, but sustaining, repeating, and adapting. Japan trusted the sword. America invested in the gear. In the end, the gear smashed the myth. Germany's own General Alfred Jodl would acknowledge this bitter truth when he signed the surrender. We were defeated by trucks. It wasn't hyperbole. It was the confession of a generation of commanders who underestimated the banal, the logistical, the redundant. If you value this detailed analysis, based on facts and forgotten documents, enjoy this video and subscribe. This helps us to continue bringing to light real stories buried by myth. Comment below. What was the most unexpected or shocking data you discovered today? And ring the bell. There are many silent truths of war that are yet to come. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.